70 years after his death, Dylan Thomas remains one of the most enduring and celebrated poets to have written in English. He employed prose in a way that expanded the limitations of the form and elevated the act of reading poetry into a new sphere of popularity just in time for the Beat generation, inspiring the likes of John Lennon, Bob Dylan, and Iggy Pop. In the spring of 1933, at the age of 19, Thomas wrote one of his better-known poems, And Death Shall Have No Dominion, a treatise on the immortal and unbreakable spirit of man, full of rich imagery and lyrical contradictions. It reads, And death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one with the man in the wind and the west moon. When their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. And death shall have no dominion. Under the windings of the sea, they lying long shall not die windily, twisting on racks when sinews give way, strapped to a wheel, yet they shall not break. Faith in their hands shall snap in two, and the unicorn evils run them through. Split all ends up, they shan't crack, and death shall have no dominion. And death shall have no dominion, no more may gulls cry at their ears, or waves break loud on the seashores. Where blew a flower, may a flower no more lift its head to the blows of the rain. Though they be mad and dead as nails, heads of the characters hammer through daisies. Break in the sun till the sun breaks down, and death shall have no dominion. Like the poets of the Romantic period a century before him, Thomas's poems typically share their titles with the first line. In this case, And Death Shall Have No Dominion appears 6 times, bookending each of the 3 stanzas as a refrain. But Thomas didn't align himself with the Romantics, even if he was greatly influenced by them. It would be more accurate to lump him in with the postmodernists of his time, except that he played by none of their rules. Most scholars just throw up their hands and declare him frustratingly singular. And Death Shall Have No Dominion references Romans 6:9 from the New Testament, which reads, Knowing that Christ, being raised from the dead, dieth no more, death hath no more dominion over him. Now, Dylan Thomas did not believe in God or a personal savior, but his body of work frequently employs this particular mythology as a sort of sparring partner with which to beat back fearful sentimentality and declare heaven a place on earth. He didn't see life and death as separate venues, but 2 sides of the same coin, as inseparable processes in which we are all participating simultaneously, which unify us as people, both living and dead, and with the whole of the natural world. From that same poem, when their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. Life does not end, he assures us. It persists indefinitely. Dying, which each of us is currently in our own process of doing at this very moment, is not the end. It's the beginning of our own personal experience with eternity. These ideas were not new in 1933, but the expression of them in Thomas's particular voice was profoundly original. Dylan Thomas was born in 1914 in Swansea on the south coast of Wales, just a few short weeks after the start of World War I. His name was taken from a character from Welsh mythology, a golden-haired baby who crawls out of his mother's womb and straight into the ocean, swimming as deftly as any fish. Dylan, or the traditional Welsh Dullan, roughly translates to son of the sea. Growing up during the Great War, it's no surprise that death fascinated him from a young age. as he watched young men conscripted to military service disappear from Swansea, one by one. A petulant and difficult child who had trouble sleeping and keeping down food, he was delicate and sickly with a weak pair of lungs. As a child, he was happiest in the park near his home, where he later confessed to climb the reservoir railing and pelt the old swans, run like a billy goat over the grass you should keep off of, carve words on the benches, pull up moss in the rockery, go snip, snip through the dahlias, fight in the bandstand, climb the elms and moon up to the top like an owl, light fire in the bushes, play on the green bank, and be happy all the time. His mother, Flory, was a seamstress and hoverer. His father, DJ, was a stuffy English teacher at the grammar school who read his children Shakespeare and Thomas Hardy, but didn't interact with them much beyond that. Often described as a small boy with a big voice, Dylan regularly accompanied the family's cleaning woman into town, where she took elocution lessons to smooth out her Welsh accent. Later in life, Thomas would become as well known for his booming English-speaking voice as he was for the poetry he read with it, what he described as his evangelical tuba. With his voice and his pen developing in tandem, Thomas's writing would evolve over the years into a form designed to be read aloud for full impact. The sounds of his words strung together was as crucial to his intent as the meaning of the words themselves. Just listen to the sly internal rhymes and alliteration that echo through this narrative passage from Under Milkwood, a scene in which a little boy is bullied by a group of young girls. And the shrill girls giggle and master around him and squeal as they clutch and thrash, and he blubbers away downhill with his patched pants falling, and his tear-splashed blush burns all the way, as the triumphant bird-like sisters scream with buttons in their claws, and the bully brothers hoot after him, his little nickname, and his mother's shame, and his father's wickedness with the loose, wild, barefoot women of the hovels of the hills. Just wait till you hear Joe read that. Thomas began his schooling at age 7, where he gave his first official poetry recitation. He called it his grave poem, and it went like this. Let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs, make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes mark sorrow on the bosom of the earth. His classroom was stunned silent. How could this child produce such poetry? He couldn't. He was passing off Shakespeare's Richard II, constantly telling lies and stealing a bottomless appetite for cigarettes and candy, picking fights with opponents twice his size, perpetually prone to accident and injury, falling downstairs, wandering into the paths of moving vehicles. This is a description of Dylan Thomas, both as a child and in later years a grown man with children of his own. His poetry began to be published in school and local literary magazines as early as age 11. Many of his first poems were dedicated to or in mourning of young men from Swansea lost to the Great War. Much of it turned out to be plagiarized from poets of the day that he admired. When he won £10 in a local poetry contest, but was later found to have passed off another poet's work as his own, his parents' only punishment was that they didn't let him cash the £10 check. They didn't want to discourage his having good enough taste to rip off a winner. He confessed as an adult that plagiarizing others was how he found his voice, saying, I wrote endless imitations, though I thought them colossally original. Things unheard of, like eggs laid by tigers. Blake, Marlowe, Poe, the Bible, Grimm, Keats, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare. I tried my little trotter at every poetical form. I had to imitate and parody, consciously and unconsciously, to learn what made words tick, beat, blaze, because I wanted to write what I wanted to write before I knew how to write. At the age of 14, he wrote Clown in the Moon, a very brief 8 lines of poetry about the ironic sadness and isolation felt by many artists and performers who bring us such happiness and connection. I initially assumed when I started this presentation that he wrote this in his later years because it speaks so accurately to the man he would come to be. The figure of the clown in the moon is only mentioned in the title, telling us that they are the speaker. My tears are like the quiet drift of petals from some magic rose, and all my grief flows from the rift of unremembered skies and snows. I think that if I touched the earth, it would crumble. It is so sad and beautiful, so tremulously like a dream. In his final years at school, he was failing most subjects that weren't English, but had taken up drama and debate where he excelled with his refined diction and roguish charisma. In 1930, at the age of 17, he attempted to raise money to start his own literary journal, but after only raising about 1/10 of the funds he hoped to, he gave up and spent it all at the pub. As editor of the school's literary magazine, he wrote about the struggle of contemporary poets to find their bearings in a world left ravaged by the Great War. Modern poetry, he argued, meant a new level of freedom in form and content, paths that were being explored at the time by D.H. Lawrence and Ezra Pound. But Thomas rejected the coming movement in contemporary poetry towards social concerns, and was more interested himself in bridging the concerns of the spirit with the concerns of the flesh. Now, moving on to university was out of the question due to his poor grades and attendance, and with the economy in a slump and no prospects, he began working in the copy room of the South Wales Evening Post. He showed up for his first day wearing a checkered overcoat and a green pork pie hat with a peacock feather tucked into the banding, and unlit cigarette hanging from his lips. Antisocial and habitually late, scribbling poetry on every surface he could, Thomas was unpopular at the Post. One of his first field assignments was to stand in for a senior reporter at the annual dinner of the Licensed Victualers Association. He was to write up the association president's speech that night, but he passed out at the open bar before the speech was given. Between his reporting on various concerts, deaths, political meetings, and interviewing people in pubs, Thomas found that he wasn't accomplishing much most nights of the week beyond drinking himself sick. Thomas and the Evening Post parted ways after about 6 months. Depressed, unemployed, and still living at home, he confessed in his diary in April of 1933, "I continue writing in the most futile manner, looking at the gas oven." There was a rabies epidemic that year in Swansea, which he used as an excuse to crawl around under the tables of pubs and bite women's ankles. An early version of "And Death Shall Have No Dominion" was published in London's New English Weekly, and although he was devastated not to have been paid for his submission, having his first poem published in London was a major accomplishment. His asthma was giving him a lot of trouble around this time, and after a doctor told him 2 packs of cigarettes a day weren't doing him any favors, he started telling people that he had tuberculosis and only 4 years to live. You'll have noticed by now the darkness inherent in the details of Thomas's personality and lifestyle. That darkness only intensifies the further along you follow with his time on Earth. But the same cannot be said for his progress and output as a poet. His next poem to be published came in 1934, "Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines." Relentlessly positive, a ballad of hope for the hopeless. Here's the first half of it. "Light breaks where no sun shines, where no sea runs, the waters of the heart push in their tides, and broken ghosts with glowworms in their heads, the things of light, file through the flesh where no flesh decks the bones. A candle in the thighs warms youth and seed, and burns the seeds of age. Where no seed stirs, The fruit of man unwrinkles in the stars, bright as a fig. Where no wax is, the candle shows its hairs. Dawn breaks behind the eyes. From poles of skull and toe, the windy blood slides like a sea. Nor fenced, nor staked, the gushers of the sky spout to the rod, divining in a smile the oil of tears. Symbolizing our capacity to hope as a light in the darkness or water flooding a dry wasteland. This is a great example of what I mentioned earlier about Thomas's desire to bridge the concerns of the spirit and the concerns of the flesh. In this case, hope springing eternal within the functions of the human body. He illustrates how our sexual desires keep us young with a candle in the thighs, warms youth and seed, and burns the seeds of age. He describes tears of joy spouting forth from the hopeful like sunbeams, with the gushers of the sky spout to the rod, divining in a smile the oil of tears. There's a restrained but potent sensuality here that kept this poem from being published in a number of places over the years. Like a lot of his early output, the accessibility of the poem's meaning is pretty remote at first reading, but provides the kind of lyrical imagery that make it possible to enjoy without full comprehension. In rehearsals for Under Milkwood, we had a lot of fun unpacking passages just like this, where we knew the prose was beautiful, but we weren't entirely confident of its meaning. My favorite example of this is the line, "A glee party sings in Bethesda graveyard, gay but muffled. Vegetables make love above the tenors." At first we thought, okay, there's a glee party singing in the graveyard, and for some reason their voices are muffled. Maybe it's cold and they're wearing scarves over their mouths. Also, vegetables make love above the tenors. So maybe there's farmland nearby at a higher elevation, since tenors would be the singers of the highest notes. Our stage manager, Hannah, finally solved this for us, suggesting that the voices might be muffled in the graveyard because they're singing underground, as in 6 feet under the vegetables. Under Milkwood does not, I assure you, require multiple viewings to enjoy or comprehend, although we won't stop you from coming back multiple times. But it does have these lovely little poetic surprises that reveal themselves throughout. Originally written as a play for voices, and typically performed on radio, putting Under Milkwood on stage with actors allows us to render these passages for the eye as well as the ear. And this analysis and investigation of the poetry is largely how we went about mounting our production. Radio plays do not come with stage directions. So we derived our own from the poetry. It was sort of like illustrating a pop-up book. Of course, we always stage our plays at the Rogue with the intention of clarifying the text for you above all. But we have never had such creative freedom to do that. The poem, Light Breaks Where No Sun Shines, marked a turning point for Dylan Thomas, in which the literary world really began to stand up and take notice. He received a letter of encouragement from T.S. Eliot. He started getting freelance writing gigs, reviewing poetry for London periodicals, and enabling him to finally move to the British capital into a seedy one-room flat he shared with a painter friend. By the end of the year, he published his first collection, called simply 18 Poems. A review back home in Swansea said of the work contained in 18 poems that Thomas had, quote, snatched today from the procession of time and made it eternal. His success did not curb his drinking, nor his getting into scrapes or kicked out of pubs. Infusions of cash typically led to more drinking and greater debts, but Now, at least, he was drinking with the likes of George Orwell and John Berryman. Some of these new friends took to calling him Ditch instead of Dylan, as in the place he had most likely crawled out of before meeting them. Thomas deeply resented the excitement and pressure of the London literary scene, which exacerbated his worst habits and kept him in poor health. Depressed and homesick, he wrote to a friend in 1935, "Everywhere I find myself seems to be nothing but a resting place between places that become resting places themselves." In this same letter, he reminisced about an unfinished short story he had begun writing in his late teens about a fictional town called Laregub, full of eccentric but unremarkable people going about their daily lives. Living in London filled Thomas with longing for the village of Laregub, confessing, "I'm sure of nothing than that world was, and still is, the only one that has any claims to permanence. I mean that this long out-of-doored world isn't much good, really. That it's only the setting for a world of my own." Laregub, of course, is the name of the fictional fishing village that would be immortalized in Under Milkwood 20 years later. In 1936, 18 poems was followed up with 25 poems, which tripled the sales numbers of its predecessor. Literary critic William Empson described the work as poetry about events which involved the universe, but which happened under the skin, what Thomas himself would later rephrase as the earthquakes of the heart. He met Irish dancer Caitlin McNamara in 1936, and the two married in July of 1937 with, according to Thomas, quote, "no money, no prospect of money, no attendant friends or relatives, and in complete happiness." In 1938, they moved to a small seaside cottage in Larne, Wales, not far from Swansea. Returning to Wales did wonders for his writing and his health. Being back in the country, you see his output gradually becoming less opaque and much more personal. He left Wales resenting his country roots, but returned with a new appreciation for the simplicity and connection of small-town life. This appreciation is summarized quite well in Under Milkwood, when a character called Voice of a Guidebook takes us on a short tour of the village of Laregub, saying, "Less than 500 souls inhabit the 3 quaint streets and the few narrow by-lanes and scattered farmsteads that constitute this small, decaying watering place, which may indeed be called a backwater of life, without disrespect to its natives, who possess to this day a salty individuality of their own. Though there is little to attract the hill climber, the health seeker, the sportsman, or the weekend-in motorist, the contemplative may, if sufficiently attracted to spare it some leisurely hours, find in its cobbled streets, in its little fishing harbor, in its several curious customs, and in the conversation of its local characters, some of that picturesque sense of the past so frequently lacking in towns and villages which have kept more abreast of the times." Further fueled by nostalgia, Thomas began writing short stories inspired by his youth, which were first published as a collection under the title Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog. In January of 1939, Thomas's first child was born, a boy named Llewellyn. In September, World War II broke out. Joking about his substantial weight gain since returning to the home-cooked meals of life in the country, he remarked about the war that he wasn't sure if he should enlist as a tank or just declare himself a neutral state. Thomas and his family made many friends in Larne, and they fully embraced him as their unofficial village poet, often turning a blind eye to his public drinking and inability to pay off debts. He and his wife contributed what they could to the community, with Thomas arranging a theatrical evening of music and prose to help raise money for the local Red Cross. Collaborating on this production with the locals as actors, he further developed the idea that would become Under Milkwood, imagining a play in which all these same locals would play versions of themselves. As he put it, they're so convinced that they're absolutely sane, normal people. I should think they'd be delighted to prove this on stage. This version of the play did not come to fruition, but some of the same villagers he was so charmed with would become the basis for several characters you'll meet in Under Milkwood, such as Holly Garter and Maud Edwards. With the Second World War making its way closer to home, Thomas was desperate to avoid even thinking about the conflict. When asked what he wanted for Christmas by a friend, he replied, "I want a war escaper, a sort of ladder, I think, attached to a balloon." He showed up so drunk to his army medical exam that he could barely stand. He was given C3 status, which meant that if he were called to serve, he would be among the very last men summoned to the front. The war years brought increased financial pressure, as well as fear of conscription, which sent Thomas traveling back and forth to England in search of permanent, full-time work that might keep him out of the fighting. He could have very easily taken a job nearby in a munitions factory close to home, but said instead that he'd, quote, rather be a poet any day and live on guile and beer than help to kill even one stranger. When the war began, his poetry had stopped selling, but when he started writing about the war, both in poetry and for radio, his audience began to expand outward from small literary circles to the wider public sphere. One such wartime poem was called "A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London," in which the speaker is unable to comprehend the human loss of war and defers grieving a little girl killed in a blitz until the day of his own death. In August of 1941, with the German bombing campaign officially declared at an end, Thomas and his wife moved back to London, leaving their son Llewellyn with Caitlin's mother. He got a job working for a documentary film outfit under the British Ministry of Information, writing slogans and voiceovers geared towards recruitment, morale, and preparing the public for life after war. But now that he was consistently making £10 a week, his finances only worsened. He was doing hack work by his own estimation, and he was pretty good at it, which only drove him more to drink. It was around this time that people started remarking that Dylan Thomas didn't usually appear sober until he had had a couple of drinks. The second child was born in 1943, though he needed to be dragged out of the pub to meet her. She was brought home in a laundry basket that the Thomases had to borrow from a friend. They attached an umbrella to the laundry basket to keep their new infant protected from the rainwater that regularly poured through their skylight, though it did not protect her from developing pneumonia within the year. This poverty was one of the many sources of contention between the poet and his wife, who found it harder and harder to live together or apart as the years went by. In 1945, the war ended and Dylan Thomas turned 30. He moved his family back to Wales, this time to Newquay on the west coast. He got his foot in the door of the BBC through the Welsh service with a short story for radio called Quite Early One Morning. This was a poetic rendering of his impressions of his new town and its residents, and features the character of Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, the fussy widow who famously says, "Before you let the sun in, mind it wipes its shoes." This was a big step forward in the development of what would become Under Milkwood, and added to Thomas's reputation not only as a poet, but a performer. He recorded and performed Quite Early One Morning for the BBC Welsh service himself, playing all the parts. In 1946, he published a new collection called Deaths and Entrances, contained some of his finest and most accessible poems yet. His popularity, especially in England, really started to soar with the war over. In a world that now contained the atomic bomb, there was a public hunger to reckon anew with life, death, and eternity. For many, the modern lyrical verse of Dylan Thomas provided just that opportunity for spiritual rebirth. Deaths and Entrances flew off the shelves. With his star on a meteoric rise, the BBC hired Thomas to write and perform a broadcast radio drama called The Londoner. This was the British version of Quite Early One Morning, which he had written and performed for the BBC Welsh service. The Londoner concerned a day in the post-war life of a young married couple, part travelogue, part docudrama, part soap opera. It features an omniscient narrator, and we first meet the characters of the story when they are asleep and dreaming out loud. This was essentially a dry run at the structure of poetic and narrative devices he would employ in Under Milkwood, all of which you'll encounter in that play's opening pages. Here to present the opening pages of Under Milkwood is the full cast of our production.
To begin at the beginning, it is spring. Moonless night in the small town, starless and Bible black, the cobble streets silent, and the hunched quarters and rabbit's wood limping invisible down to the slow black, crow black fishing boat bobbing sea. The houses are blind as moles, though moles see fine tonight in the snouting velvet dingles, or blind as Captain Cat there in the muffled middle, by the pump and the town clock, the shops in mourning, the welfare hall in widow's weeds, and all the people of the lulled and dumbfound town are sleeping now. Hush, the babies are sleeping. The farmers, the fishers, the tradesmen and pensioners, cobbler, school teacher, postman and publican, the undertaker and the fancy woman, drunkard, dressmaker, preacher, policeman, the webfoot cockle women and the tidy wives. Young girls lie bedded soft, or glide in their dreams with rings and trousseaux, bridesmaided by glowworms down the aisles of the organ-playing wood. The boys are dreaming wicked, or of the bucking ranches of the night and the Jolly Roger'd sea. And the anthracite statues of the horses sleep in the fields, and the cows in the byres, and the dogs in the wet-nosed yards, and the cats nap in the slant corners, or lope sly, streaking and needling on the one cloud of the roofs. You can hear the dew falling and the hushed town breathing.
Only your eyes are unclosed to see the black and folded town fast and slow asleep. And you alone can hear the invisible starfall, the darkest before dawn, minutely dew-grazed stir of the black dab-filled sea. Listen. It is night, moving in the streets. It is the grass growing on Laregab Hill, dewfall, starfall, the sleep of birds in Milkwood. Look, it is night, dumbly, royally winding through the coronation cherry trees, going through the graveyard at Bethesda with winds gloved and folded and dew-doffed, and tumbling by the sailor's arms. Time passes. Listen. Time passes.
Come closer now. Only you can hear the houses sleeping in the streets in the slow, deep salt and silent black bandaged night. Only you can see in the blinded bedrooms the combs and petticoats over the chairs, the jugs and basins, the glasses of teeth, thou shalt not on the wall, and the yellowing dicky bird watching pictures of the dead. Only you can hear and see behind the eyes of the sleepers, the movements and countries and mazes and colors and dismays and rainbows and tunes and wishes and flight and fall and despairs and big seas of their dreams. From where you are, you can hear their dreams. Captain Cat, the retired blind sea captain asleep in his bunk in the sea-shelled, ship-embottled, ship-shaped best cabin of schooner house, dreams of never such seas as any that swabbed the decks of his SS Kidwelly, bellying over the bedclothes, and jellyfish slippery sucking him down salt deep into the davy dark, where the fish come biting out and nibble him down to his wishbone, and the long drowned nuzzle up to him.
Remember me, Captain!
You're Dancing Williams.
I lost my step in Nantucket.
Do you see me, Captain? The white bone talking. I'm Tom Fred the Donkey Man. We shared the same girl once. Her name was Mrs. Probert.
Rosie Probert, 33 Duck Lane. Come on up, boys. I'm dead.
Hold me, Captain! I'm Jonah Jarvis, come to a bad end, very enjoyable.
Alfred Pomeroy Jones, sea lawyer born in Mumbles, sung like a linnet, crowned you with a flagon, tattooed with mermaids, thirst like a dredger, died of blisters.
This skull at your ear hole is...
Curly Bevan, tell my auntie it was me that pawned the Ormolu clock.
Aye, Curly.
Tell my missus, no, I never.
I never done what she said, I never.
Yes, they did.
And who brings shawls to my Gwen now?
Oh, how's it above?
Is there rum and lava bread?
Bosoms and robins,
Concertinas,
Ebenezer's bell,
Fighting and onions.
Sparrows and daisies.
tiddlers in a jam jar.
buttermilk, and whippets.
rockabye baby,
Washing on the line.
And old girls in the snug.
when she smiles. Is there dimples?
What's the smell of parsley?
Oh, my dead dears.
From where you are, you can hear in Cockle Row in the spring moonless night, Miss Price, dressmaker and sweet shopkeeper, dream of her lover. Tall as the town clock tower, gold-maned, whacking-thighed and piping hot, thunderbolt-based and barnacle-breasted, flailing up the cockles with his eyes like blow lamps, and scooping low over her lonely, loving, hot water-bottled body.
Me Vonwy Price.
Mr. Mogg Edwards.
I am a draper mad with love. I love you more than all the flannelette and calico, candlewick, crape-on, muslin, poplin, ticking and twill in the whole cloth hall of the world. I have come to take you away to my emporium on the hill where the change hums on wires. Throw away your little bed socks and your Welsh wool knitted jacket. I will warm the sheets like an electric toaster. I will lie by your side like the Sunday roast.
I will knit you a wallet of forget-me-not blue for the money to be comfy. I will warm your heart by the fire so you can slip it in under your vest when the shop is closed.
Me Vonwy, before the mice gnaw at your bottom drawer, will you say?
Yes, Mogg! Yes, Mogg! Yes, yes, yes!
And all the bells of the tills of the town shall ring for our wedding.
Ladies and gentlemen, the cast of Under Milkwood. So from this point on, the play continues to introduce us to a variety of characters throughout the town, all of them sleeping and dreaming out loud. Characters such as Captain Cat and Polly Garter dream of dead lovers who remain ghostly by their side. But in a brilliant twist, Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, who is alive and well, haunts the ghosts of her dead husbands, who lie next to her in bed all night reciting the list of household chores she once gave them when they were alive. Gradually, the sun comes up, and the characters go about their daily lives, having breakfast, sharing gossip at the general store, working, avoiding working, delivering the mail, bantering with their spouse, feeding the chickens, playing the organ, drinking in the pub, even something as mundane as sitting and looking out the window is lyrically rendered with profound humor and pathos. Maug Edward and Mavonwe Price, the last two characters you saw, write one another love letters from opposite ends of town, but never meet or speak in person. Sinbad sailors and Gossamer Binen fantasize about one another day and night, but both are too afraid to act. After dreaming all night about riding a pig through the streets and shooting giblets out of the sky, Butcher Binen tells his wife over breakfast that they're eating the cat and that his plans for the day include butchering some neighborhood dogs. He's not serious. He's just getting along. Even more morbid, Mr. Pugh dreams all day of poisoning his wife, Mrs. Pugh. He never does poison her, but the fantasy seems to get him through the day. Thomas seems to be suggesting that having what we want doesn't get us out of bed in the morning so much as the unfulfilled dreams we carry with us. The play ends with the setting of the sun. Everybody goes back to bed, and the characters' dreams start up again, bringing Under Milkwood right back to where it started. The omniscient narrator, which Thomas called first voice, has been split into first, second, and third voice for our production. On stage, this helps us imbue just a bit more movement into the delivery of the narration. I love the way the voices instruct us to listen, look, come closer now, inviting us to lean in as we encounter the language of the play, but also as a reminder of the momentary peace that all poetry provides, whether we're alone with a book or packed together into an audience. The combination of Thomas's voice and prose were soon widespread in the realm of radio. Between poetry readings, travelogues, short stories, lectures, and panel discussions, he contributed to over 50 radio programs in 1946 alone, earning him £700 or a little over £36,000 adjusted for inflation. Add to this public speaking or reading fees and the royalties from his very popular new book of poems, Dylan Thomas was no longer destitute and finally able to lead somewhat of a stable life. He was still, however, essentially broke. His son, taking after him, was quite sickly with asthma and required expensive medical treatments. He also generated costly boarding school bills. And then there were the mounting lawsuits coming in from various publishers who had paid handsome advances for books and poems that never materialized. By this time, Thomas was regularly in and out of hospital with heart problems, trouble breathing, alcohol poisoning, and gout. Frequently performing drunk, it's been widely reported that on more than one occasion, Thomas could be found vomiting into a nearby bucket or fireplace during his own standing ovations. He's the world's first rock star poet. He even had groupies, usually college students, who he would pick up with lines like, "How would you like to fornicate with an oval Welshman?" Success and fame were one thing, but what he really wanted was to go to America. Those close to him were firmly against the idea, fearing he might finally drink himself to death if let loose in San Francisco or Greenwich Village. In May of 1949, Thomas and his family moved back to the seaside village of Larne in Wales. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived from the Poetry Center at the Young Men and Young Women's Hebrew Association of New York. It was an offer of $500 to come and read. This came with a promise to schedule his visit with numerous additional paid speaking engagements throughout New York and across the country. He responded immediately in the affirmative. Travel arrangements were made for the following winter. When a friend expressed concern about his drinking before his trip to America, Thomas replied that it is only frightening when I am whirlingly perplexed, when my ordinary troubles are magnified into monsters, and gave the assurance that at most times he was merely a dull, happy fellow, only wanting to put into words the ordered turbulence, the ubiquitous and rinsing grief, the unreasonable glory of the world I know and don't know. Thomas arrived in New York in February of 1950, and his first big shock was the Manhattan skyline, which he described in a letter to his wife as an enormous facade of speed and efficiency and power behind which millions of little individuals are wrestling in vain with their own anxieties. America, this vast, mad horror that doesn't know its own size, or its strength, or its weakness, or its barbaric speed, stupidity, din, self-righteousness, this cancerous Babylon. He was in heaven. His first reading in New York was for a standing room only crowd of about 1,000, including reclusive poet E.E. Cummings. Thomas was mobbed in the lobby afterwards by such a rabid crowd that the event organizers feared for his safety. Keeping with the rock star vibe, he was thrown out of his hotel the following night. For 3 relentless months, he performed poetry and partied in one city after another. He only really slept on airplanes and passenger trains. I'm hardly living, he wrote home. I'm just a voice on wheels. This was the first of 4 American tours he would take between 1950 and 1953. Back home, in between trips to the States, he worked away at Under Milkwood, which was initially called the Town That Was Mad. The Town That Was Mad had something you won't find in Under Milkwood, a traditional storyline. Now, the original conceit was that the residents of the town, as part of some strange post-war legislation, were all declared mad by the local government and had to go to trial to defend their sanity on a case-by-case basis. In the end, the town loses the trial, and their defense lawyer, Captain Cat, declares the outcome a triumph of individuality. And while the finished play does present its characters in somewhat of an incriminating exhibition, this plotline was abandoned. Thomas's script for The Town That Was Mad was soon retitled Laregub, and finally, Under Milkwood, a title that Thomas felt would properly communicate the innocent, sensuous, and provincial themes of his play to audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. In the summer of 1951, he wrote his best-known poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. I'd like to play a recording of Dylan Thomas reading it himself.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
poem was plainly for Thomas's father, who was in declining health and losing his sight when it was written. We also see Thomas wrestling with his legacy as an artist, as he speaks of frail deeds and words that forked no lightning. As he said to a colleague that summer, "A poet sings in the direction of his pain." In January of 1952, Thomas arrived in New York for his second American tour, this time with his wife in tow. This tour lasted 4 months and did nothing to heal their marriage, which only grew increasingly strained and publicly violent. Worse still, his health and finances continued to suffer. In April of 1953, Thomas returned to America a third time to give the first public performance of Under Milkwood. A cast of 6 actors, including Thomas, took to the stage with a script that had been finished about an hour before showtime. It received 14 curtain calls before Thomas took a final bow for himself. After spending nearly his entire life shaping and developing this play for voices, it was an enormous relief. Later on this same trip, Thomas broke his arm, falling down a flight of stairs on his way to see The Crucible on Broadway. After meeting the poet later that night, Arthur Miller remarked that this man appeared to be methodically making his exit from the world. The life spent falling down had recently resulted in a blood clot in Thomas's right temple, causing him to intermittently black out. But things were beginning to look up after his third American tour. His finances were very slowly beginning to turn around, and interest in publishing and broadcast rights for Under Milkwood was through the roof. He returned to America a 4th time in 1953 to take his final draft of Under Milkwood on tour. You get a sense from his many biographies that Thomas knew he was nearing the end. When asked one night at a party in New York why he appeared not to be drinking, he replied, "Well, it's just that I've seen the gates of hell." Despite this stark change of tone from a man who liked to say he preferred the illness to the cure, he was unable to abstain for more than a few hours that night. He fell into a coma at the Chelsea Hotel on November 5th, likely caused by alcohol poisoning and the excessive amount of morphine he was being given at the time to help him sleep and breathe. He died 4 days later at the age of 39. Cause of death was attributed at the time to complications from pneumonia and emphysema. Surprisingly, and I don't mean to be flip, his liver was discovered to be in fine shape. One of the most challenging aspects of preparing this talk for today was in reconciling the darkness of this man's life with the bright light of his prose. It was commented shortly after his death that it must be a kind of grace, the ability of this hard-drinking lost boy to remind us of the universal beauty in the everyday that we so often take for granted as meaningless or mundane. That's my talk. Thank you for your time.